My neighbor, who never texts, texted me at 2 a.m. I just saw your teenage son climb out his window with a black eye and a packed bag. I stared at my phone screen in the dark bedroom, the text from Gerald Hobbs burning into my retinas. Gerald was 73, a retired postal worker who'd lived next door for 18 years and had never once sent me a text message. He called if the mail got mixed up, or knocked on the door if our trash bins blew into his yard. The fact that he was texting me at 2 in the morning meant something was catastrophically wrong. I sat up in bed, and my wife Vanessa stirred beside me, but didn't wake. I pulled on sweatpants and a shirt, my hands shaking as I typed back, asking if Gerald was sure it was our son. 3 dots appeared immediately, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, his response came through with a photo attached. The image showed my 15-year-old son Kevin climbing down the trellis outside his second-floor window, a dark backpack slung over his shoulder. Even in the grainy security camera footage, the swelling around his left eye was visible. I was out of bed and down the hallway in seconds, taking the stairs 2 at a time. Kevin's bedroom door was closed, and I knocked once before pushing it open. The room was empty. His bed was made, which should have been my first clue because Kevin never made his bed. The window was open and cold November air poured through the gap. I looked out and saw the trellis he'd used to climb down, the same trellis I'd installed 6 years ago when Vanessa wanted climbing roses. I grabbed my phone and called Kevin's cell. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again. Same result. I sent him a text telling him to call me immediately, that I wasn't angry, and just needed to know he was safe. The message showed as delivered but not read. I stood in his empty room trying to process what was happening and why my son had a black eye I hadn't known about, and why he was running away in the middle of the night with a packed bag. My phone buzzed with another text from Gerald. He got into a gray sedan, 2 people inside, couldn't see faces. Car went north toward the highway. I called Gerald, and he answered on the first ring, his voice gravelly with sleep and concern. I was up using the bathroom and saw movement from my window. Thought it might be a burglar at first. Then I realized it was Kevin. That's when I saw his face under the streetlight. That black eye looked fresh, Stephen. Real fresh. I thanked Gerald and told him I'd handle it from here, though I had no idea how I was going to handle anything. I went back to my bedroom where Vanessa was now sitting up, looking at her phone. She'd apparently seen my texts to Kevin and was trying to call him herself. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice tight with the kind of panic only a parent can feel. I told her everything Gerald had seen and watched her face go white. "He has a black eye? When did that happen?" "He was fine at dinner." I thought back to dinner 6 hours ago. Kevin had been quiet, but that wasn't unusual lately. He was 15 and moody and spent most meals staring at his plate. He'd gone up to his room around 8, saying he had homework. I'd checked on him at 10, and he was at his desk with headphones on, supposedly doing math problems. He'd waved at me without taking the headphones off, and I'd closed his door, thinking he was fine. Now I realized I hadn't actually seen his face clearly because the desk lamp created shadows, and he'd been turned partially away from me. The black eye could have already been there. Vanessa was pulling on clothes and asking if we should call the police. I didn't know. What would I tell them? My son climbed out his window voluntarily with a packed bag and got into a car with people we didn't know. Was that even a police matter or just a parenting failure? I called Kevin's phone 5 more times while Vanessa got dressed. Nothing. I tried his 2 closest friends, Noah and Ben, but both calls went straight to voicemail because normal teenagers were asleep at 2 in the morning. I texted their parents apologizing for the late hour and asking them to have their sons call me urgently if they heard from Kevin. Then I went to Kevin's room and started looking for clues about what might have driven him to run away. His laptop was gone, taken with him in the backpack Gerald had seen. His phone charger was missing from the outlet by his bed. His dresser drawers were partially open, and I could see gaps where clothes had been removed. This wasn't impulsive. This was planned. Kevin had packed carefully and waited until we were asleep to execute his escape. The premeditation made it worse somehow, made it clear this wasn't a momentary teenage rebellion, but something he'd thought through. Vanessa found Kevin's journal in his desk drawer, tucked under some school papers. She held it up, asking if we should read it, and I could see the moral conflict on her face. Reading your kid's private journal violated trust and boundaries we'd always respected. But Kevin was missing with a black eye, and those boundaries seemed less important than finding him. Vanessa opened to the most recent entry, dated yesterday. Kevin's handwriting was rushed and angry, the pen pressing hard enough into the paper that some words were underlined by accident. Coach Davies called me a waste of space again today in front of the whole team. Said I was too weak to play varsity and should quit before I embarrass myself further. He made me run laps while everyone else scrimmaged. When I finally stopped because I was going to throw up, he got in my face and shoved me. I fell and hit my head on the bleachers. That's how I got the black eye. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest as I read those words. Coach Davies was the basketball coach at Kevin's high school, a man in his late 40s who'd played college ball and treated coaching like it was still his glory days. I'd met him twice at school events, and both times he'd struck me as intense but dedicated. The idea that he was verbally abusing my son and had physically assaulted him made me want to drive to his house immediately and return the favor. Vanessa kept reading aloud from the journal. I told Dad I wanted to quit basketball last month, and he said I just needed to toughen up and push through. He doesn't understand that Coach Davies hates me specifically. He picks on me every single practice, calls me soft, worthless, a disappointment. Today, when he shoved me and I got hurt, he told me if I said anything to anyone, he'd make sure I never played basketball anywhere. He'd tell every coach in the state I was a liability and a quitter. The entry continued with Kevin describing how he felt trapped between a coach who abused him and parents who didn't believe him when he tried to explain. He wrote about lying to us about the black eye, planning to say he got hit with a ball during practice. He wrote about feeling worthless and wondering if Coach Davies was right, that he was too weak for sports, or maybe for anything. The final paragraph made my hands shake. I can't stay here anymore. Coach made it clear today that this is only going to get worse. Mom and Dad don't get it, and I don't know how to make them understand without proof. So I'm leaving. Noah's older brother Kyle said I can stay with him in Portland for a while. Kyle graduated 2 years ago and has an apartment. He understands what it's like to have a parent who doesn't listen. I'll be safe there, and maybe once I'm gone, they'll realize I wasn't lying about any of this. Vanessa looked at me with tears streaming down her face. He tried to tell us, and we didn't listen. He said he wanted to quit basketball, and I told him he made a commitment to the team. I didn't ask why he wanted to quit. I just assumed he was being lazy. I felt the same crushing guilt because Kevin had mentioned problems with the coach multiple times over the past 2 months, and I'd dismissed it as teenage exaggeration or normal coaching toughness. I'd played high school sports and remembered coaches yelling and pushing us hard. I'd thought that was just part of building discipline and resilience. It never occurred to me that what Kevin was describing was abuse, that a grown man was systematically tearing down my son's self-worth and had escalated to physical violence. I pulled out my phone and called Noah's mother, Caroline, even though it was now 2:30 in the morning. She answered on the 4th ring, sounding groggy and confused. I apologized for waking her and explained that Kevin had run away and mentioned her son's older brother Kyle in his journal. Caroline was immediately alert and said Kyle lived in Portland, about 4 hours north of us. She gave me Kyle's phone number and address, saying she'd call Kyle herself to give him a heads up. I thanked her and hung up, then immediately dialed Kyle's number. A young man's voice answered after 6 rings, guarded and wary. "This is Stephen Chen, Kevin's father. Is my son with you?" There was a long pause, and I could hear muffled voices in the background. Then Kyle came back on the line. "Yeah, he's here. He's safe. He asked me not to tell you where he was, but I guess you figured it out." Relief and anger fought for dominance in my chest. Relief that Kevin was physically safe. Anger that he'd put us through this panic. Anger at myself for not seeing the signs. Anger at Coach Davies for causing all of this. "I need to talk to Kevin." Kyle hesitated, and I heard him talking to someone quietly, probably Kevin. Then he said, Kevin didn't want to talk to me right now, but would call in the morning. I told Kyle that wasn't acceptable, that Kevin was 15 years old and couldn't just run away from home because things got difficult. Kyle's response surprised me. "With all due respect, Mr. Chen, things didn't just get difficult. Your son has been getting abused by his coach for months, and when he tried to tell you, you told him to toughen up. He has a black eye from being shoved into bleachers. He's covered in bruises from practices where the coach singles him out for extra punishment. He needed help and didn't get it, so he left. Maybe instead of demanding he come home, you should think about why he felt he had to leave in the first place." The line went dead before I could respond. I stood there holding the phone, Kyle's words echoing in my head, covered in bruises, not just the black eye, but other injuries we hadn't seen because we hadn't been looking. Vanessa had been listening to my side of the conversation, and now she looked stricken. We failed him. Our son was being hurt, and we missed it completely. I wanted to argue that we hadn't missed it, that Kevin hadn't been clear about how bad things were, but I knew that was a lie. He'd been clear enough. He'd asked to quit basketball. He'd mentioned the coach being mean. He'd been withdrawn and moody for weeks. All the signs had been there, and we'd dismissed them because we were busy with work and life, and assumed teenage complaints were just teenage drama. I sat down on Kevin's bed, feeling the full weight of my failure as a parent. My phone buzzed with a text from Kyle. It was a photo showing Kevin sitting on a couch, very much alive and unharmed except for the visible black eye. The text said, "He's safe. Give him space. He'll call you when he's ready." I showed the photo to Vanessa and she started crying harder, the kind of sobbing that comes from relief mixed with guilt. We stayed in Kevin's room for another hour trying to figure out what to do next. Calling the police to drag Kevin home seemed counterproductive given why he'd left, but letting him stay in Portland with Kyle indefinitely wasn't a real solution either. Finally, Vanessa said we needed to deal with Coach Davies before anything else. Kevin had left because he felt trapped and unprotected. The only way to fix that was to remove the threat. At 5 in the morning, I started researching Coach Davies online. His full name was Mitchell Davies, and he'd been coaching at Riverside High for 7 years. I found his social media profiles, all public, full of photos of basketball teams and motivational quotes about pushing through pain and never accepting weakness. The comments on his posts were mostly from students and parents praising his dedication. But when I searched his name with the word complaint or investigation, I found a news article from 3 years ago. The article was from a small community newspaper and detailed a complaint filed against Coach Davies by a parent whose son had quit the basketball team, citing verbal abuse and excessive physical training that resulted in injuries. The school district had investigated and found insufficient evidence of misconduct. The parent had withdrawn the complaint after the coach threatened to sue for defamation. The article mentioned 2 other families who'd had concerns but hadn't filed formal complaints. I showed this to Vanessa, and her jaw tightened. He's done this before. The school knows and they protected him anyway. I called Riverside High's principal at 6 in the morning, not caring that it was still before dawn. The call went to voicemail, and I left a message explaining that my son had a black eye from being assaulted by Coach Davies and had run away from home because he felt unsafe. I said I'd be at the school when it opened at 7:30 and expected to speak with administrators immediately. Vanessa and I drove to the school at 7, parking in the empty lot and waiting for staff to arrive. The principal's car pulled in at 7:15, and I recognized her from parent-teacher conferences. Her name was Dr. Ellen Reeves, and she looked startled to see us waiting by her parking space. I approached quickly and said we needed to talk about Coach Davies assaulting my son. She invited us inside to her office, her professional demeanor firmly in place, but I could see concern in her eyes. In her office, I showed her the journal entries and the photo of Kevin's black eye that Kyle had sent. Dr. Reeves read carefully and then asked detailed questions about when this happened and whether we'd seen the injuries ourselves. I admitted we hadn't seen them because Kevin had hidden them and we hadn't been paying enough attention. Dr. Reeves sighed and pulled out a file from her cabinet. Coach Davies has been the subject of 3 previous complaints in the 7 years he's worked here. She showed us the file, which contained documentation of the complaints. All 3 had been from parents reporting verbal abuse and excessive physical discipline. In each case, the school had investigated by interviewing Coach Davies and team members. In each case, other players had defended the coach, saying he was tough but fair and that the complaining student was oversensitive or lazy. The complaints had been dismissed, and the families had either withdrawn their children from the team or moved to different schools. Dr. Reeves explained that without corroborating witnesses or physical evidence, it was difficult to take action against a coach who was otherwise successful and popular. I asked what the threshold was for protecting students if multiple families reporting abuse wasn't enough. She didn't have a good answer for that. I told her I wanted Coach Davies fired immediately, and that if the school didn't take action, I'd be contacting the police and filing criminal assault charges. I'd also be contacting every parent of every player on that team to inform them about the pattern of abuse. Dr. Reeves said she'd need to conduct an investigation before making any personnel decisions. I said Kevin's black eye was all the investigation she needed, and that I'd give her until end of business today to respond before I escalated this further. Vanessa added that we'd be documenting everything from this point forward and wouldn't accept another cover-up. Dr. Reeves looked uncomfortable, but agreed to interview Coach Davies that morning and call us with an update. We left the school and drove home to figure out our next steps. I called Kyle again, and this time Kevin answered. His voice was small and defensive when he said hello. I told him I was sorry, that I should have listened when he tried to tell me about the coach, that I'd failed him as a father by dismissing his concerns. There was silence on the line for a long moment, and then Kevin asked what I was going to do about Coach Davies. I told him I'd already talked to the principal and was prepared to file criminal charges if the school didn't take appropriate action. I told him I'd read his journal and seen the photo of his black eye, and understood now that this wasn't about toughening up or pushing through. This was about an adult in a position of authority abusing that power to hurt a child. Kevin's voice cracked when he spoke again. He told me I was worthless every single day. He said I'd never amount to anything, and that I was wasting everyone's time by even trying. When I fell and hit my head yesterday, he laughed and said, maybe now I'd learn to be less clumsy. The other guys on the team didn't say anything because they're scared of him too. If you speak up, he makes your life hell until you quit. I told Kevin I believed him, and that I was going to make sure Coach Davies never hurt another student. Kevin said he wasn't ready to come home yet, that he needed some time to process everything. I said that was okay, and that he could stay with Kyle as long as he checked in with us twice a day and kept going to school remotely if Kyle's school district would allow it. After we hung up, I sat down and wrote a detailed email to the school district superintendent, copying the school board and attaching Kevin's journal entries and the photo of his injuries. I outlined the pattern of complaints against Coach Davies and explained that my son had felt unsafe enough to run away from home rather than continue being abused. I CC'd my lawyer, a family law attorney named Patricia Vance, who'd handled our wills and estate planning. Patricia called me within 20 minutes of receiving the email. She said this was outside her usual practice area, but she had a colleague who specialized in education law and civil rights cases. She'd make an introduction and have him contact me today. True to her word, I got a call an hour later from an attorney named Robert Mills. Mills asked me to walk him through everything and took detailed notes. When I finished, he said we had a strong case for civil action against both Coach Davies and the school district for failing to protect students despite documented complaints. Mills explained that Title IX required schools to protect students from harassment and abuse, and the pattern of dismissed complaints showed systemic failure. He said he'd be willing to take the case and would start by sending a formal demand letter to the district. But he warned me that these cases often got ugly, that the school would likely defend the coach aggressively, and that Kevin would potentially need to testify about the abuse. I said I understood and wanted to move forward. Kevin deserved justice, and other students deserved protection from Coach Davies. Mills said he'd draft the demand letter and have it to me for review by end of day. At 3 that afternoon, Dr. Reeves called. She said she'd interviewed Coach Davies and several team members. Coach Davies denied ever touching Kevin inappropriately and said the black eye must have come from normal basketball contact during drills. 2 players confirmed that Kevin had taken a hard fall during practice, but said it appeared accidental. Dr. Reeves said, based on this investigation, they couldn't conclusively determine misconduct had occurred. I asked if she was seriously telling me that my son's detailed journal entries and visible injuries weren't enough evidence. She said the journal was Kevin's perspective, and perspectives could be biased, and that the injuries could have happened the way Coach Davies described. I told her I'd be moving forward with legal action, and hung up. Mills's demand letter arrived in my email an hour later. It was 8 pages of detailed legal argument laying out the pattern of abuse, the school's failure to act on complaints, and the violation of Kevin's rights. It demanded Coach Davies's immediate termination, a formal apology from the district, policy changes to protect students from coaching abuse, and financial compensation for Kevin's suffering. Mills gave me until the next day to review and approve, Then he'd send it directly to the superintendent and school board with copies to local media. I approved it that evening and told Mills to send it first thing in the morning. The letter went out at 8 the next morning, and by noon, my phone was ringing with reporters asking for comments. The story had broken in local news, framed as a lawsuit against the school district over coaching abuse. I gave a brief statement saying my son had been systematically abused by his coach, had sustained injuries, and had felt so unsafe he ran away from home. I said the school had dismissed multiple complaints about this coach and that we were seeking accountability. By evening, the story was the top item on 3 local news stations. Parents started calling me, some supportive and some angry. One mother said her son had quit basketball last year because of Coach Davies, and she wished she'd pushed harder for consequences. Another father called me a troublemaker who was trying to ruin a good coach's career over normal discipline. I started getting hate mail accusing me of raising a weak son who couldn't handle tough coaching. The divide was sharp and ugly, splitting the school community between those who believed coaching abuse was real and those who thought we were overreacting. The school board held an emergency meeting 3 days later to discuss the situation. The meeting was open to the public, and the auditorium was packed with parents, students, and media. Mills attended with me and Vanessa. The board heard from the superintendent, who defended the district's investigation and said they'd found no evidence of abuse. Then Mills presented our case, showing the journal entries, the photo of Kevin's injuries, the history of previous complaints, and statements from 2 other families willing to go on record about their own children's experiences with Coach Davies. One mother described her daughter quitting basketball after Coach Davies called her fat and useless in front of the team. Another father talked about his son developing anxiety and depression after months of verbal abuse from the coach. The board members looked increasingly uncomfortable as the evidence piled up. Finally, Coach Davies himself was allowed to speak. He stood at the podium in a suit and tie, looking calm and professional. He said he'd dedicated his life to helping young people become better athletes and better people through sports. He said he had high standards and pushed his players to reach their potential, which sometimes meant tough love and difficult conversations. He said Kevin was a sensitive kid who'd taken normal coaching feedback personally and had quit rather than put in the work to improve. He said the black eye was an accident during a legitimate basketball drill and that he'd never intentionally hurt any student. Several parents and former players stood up to defend him, talking about how Coach Davies had helped them develop discipline and resilience. One student said Coach Davies was the best coach he'd ever had and that Kevin was lying because he couldn't handle being pushed. The board said they'd deliberate and issue a decision within a week. Mills told me afterward that the board was clearly torn and that we might not get the outcome we wanted. Kevin called me that night from Portland. He'd been watching news coverage of the board meeting online and was terrified about having to come back and face everyone at school. He said kids were already posting about him on social media, calling him a snitch and saying he'd ruined the basketball program. Some were saying he deserved what happened for being weak. I told Kevin he didn't have to come back until he was ready and that we'd figure out alternative schooling if necessary. But I also told him he'd done nothing wrong by telling the truth and that standing up to abuse was never something to be ashamed of. Kevin said he just wanted this to be over and to feel safe again. I promised him I'd keep fighting until Coach Davies couldn't hurt anyone else. The school board issued their decision 6 days after the meeting. They placed Coach Davies on paid administrative leave pending further investigation. They hired an outside firm to conduct independent interviews with current and former players. And they issued a formal apology to our family for not taking previous complaints seriously enough. It wasn't everything we wanted, but it was progress. Mills said paid leave often led to termination once the investigation revealed more evidence. He said the independent investigation was crucial because it removed the school's conflict of interest. Over the next 3 weeks, the investigating firm interviewed 42 current and former basketball players. Kevin agreed to speak with them via video call from Portland. The firm's report came out 5 weeks after the board meeting. It was devastating. The report found credible evidence that Coach Davies had engaged in a pattern of verbal abuse, including name-calling, public humiliation, and threats against multiple students over several years. It found evidence that he'd used excessive physical discipline, including forcing injured players to continue training and pushing students in ways that resulted in injuries. It documented how he'd created a culture of fear, where players were afraid to report abuse because they'd seen previous complaints dismissed and complainers punished. The report recommended Coach Davies' immediate termination, mandatory training for all coaches on appropriate discipline and recognizing abuse, and policy changes to create better reporting mechanisms for student complaints. The school board voted unanimously to terminate Coach Davies' employment at an emergency meeting. He hired a lawyer and threatened to sue for wrongful termination, but Mills said that threat wouldn't go anywhere given the investigation's findings. 2 weeks after the termination, the district attorney's office called me. They'd reviewed the case and were filing criminal charges against Coach Davies for assault and child endangerment. The charges stemmed from Kevin's injuries and 2 other documented cases where students had been hurt during practices. The DA said they wanted Kevin to testify at trial and asked if he'd be willing. I said I'd talk to him, but that his mental health and safety were priorities. Kevin had been in Portland for 3 months by this point. He was attending school remotely through the district's online program and seeing a therapist twice a week. He'd started playing basketball again at a community center near Kyle's apartment. Just pick-up games with no coaches, and he said he was remembering why he'd loved the sport before Coach Davies ruined it. When I asked about testifying, Kevin was scared, but said he'd do it if it meant preventing Coach Davies from coaching anywhere else. The trial was scheduled for 6 months out. In the meantime, Mills negotiated a settlement with the school district for their civil liability. They agreed to pay $300,000 to cover Kevin's therapy, lost educational opportunities, and pain and suffering. More importantly, they agreed to implement comprehensive policy changes around coaching oversight and student complaint procedures. Mills called it a significant victory that would protect future students even if the criminal trial didn't result in conviction. The criminal trial lasted 4 days. Kevin testified on the second day, describing months of verbal abuse and the incident where Coach Davies shoved him into the bleachers. The defense attorney tried to paint Kevin as oversensitive and questioned why he hadn't reported the abuse immediately. Kevin's voice was steady when he explained that he had tried to report it to his parents and the school, but nobody listened until he ran away. 3 other former players testified about similar experiences with Coach Davies. The coach's defense was that his methods were tough but effective, and that parents these days were too protective of their children. The jury deliberated for 7 hours before returning guilty verdicts on 2 counts of assault and 1 count of child endangerment. Coach Davies was sentenced to 18 months in prison and 5 years probation. He was also permanently barred from working with minors in any capacity. Kevin cried when I called to tell him about the verdict, but they were tears of relief rather than sadness. 8 months after that first text from Gerald, Kevin came home from Portland. He enrolled back at Riverside High for his junior year, but switched to the lacrosse team where the coach had a reputation for being supportive and positive. He continued therapy and slowly rebuilt his confidence. The settlement money was put in a trust fund for his college education. Gerald still kept watch from his window next door, but now Kevin waved to him every morning on his way to school. 3 other families reached out to us about their own experiences with abusive coaches at different schools, and Mills took on 2 of those cases. Kevin started speaking at school board meetings about the importance of listening to students and taking complaints seriously. At one meeting, a board member thanked him for his bravery and said the policy changes implemented after his case had already led to 2 other coaches being removed from positions after students felt safe enough to report abuse. Kevin told me later that knowing he'd helped protect other kids made everything he'd gone through feel worthwhile. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.